What if some of Britain's most honest war films failed, not because they were bad, but because they told the truth too early? At the box office, these movies stumbled, audiences resisted them, studios quietly moved on. But time has been far kinder. These are British war films that bombed on release, then aged like gold. Let's begin at the bottom of the countdown. Number 15, Too Late the Hero, 1970. When Too Late the Hero arrived in 1970, it couldn't have picked a worse moment. War films were in cultural freefall. Vietnam had shattered romantic myths of combat, and audiences were exhausted by hero narratives that felt dishonest. Marketed as a gritty adventure with familiar faces, the film instead delivered something far more corrosive. A savage, almost nihilistic dismantling of leadership, masculinity, and battlefield purpose. Viewers stayed away. Critics were confused. The box office collapse was swift. The film rejects the traditional British war framework entirely. There is no noble command structure, no reassuring sense of moral clarity. Instead, we get dysfunctional leadership, paranoia, cruelty, and men who survive mostly by accident. Michael Caine's performance, cold, ambiguous, and morally compromised, ran counter to his heroic screen image. For an audience still conditioned to expect gallantry, Too Late the Hero felt punishing rather than entertaining. In hindsight, the film looks prophetic. Long before revisionist war cinema became mainstream, Too Late the Hero exposed the fragility of authority under pressure. Its jungle setting is less a battlefield than a psychological trap, where ideology collapses and survival becomes arbitrary. Modern critics and historians now recognize it as one of the earliest British films to fully embrace the idea that war erodes identity rather than affirming it. What once felt bleak now feels brutally honest. This isn't a war movie about victory. It's about moral erosion, and that's exactly why it's finally being taken seriously. Number 14, The Long and the Short and the Tall, 1961. Released in 1961, The Long and the Short and the Tall was too intense for mainstream audiences and too psychologically raw for critics expecting conventional wartime drama. Set during a jungle patrol gone wrong, the film strips away patriotism and focuses instead on fear, mistrust, and the slow collapse of group cohesion. It earned modest attention and then disappeared. Commercially, it failed to justify itself. Audiences were unsettled by its tone. There's no comfort here, no rousing speeches, no triumphant arc. The enemy is barely visible, and the real conflict unfolds between the soldiers themselves. This inward-facing tension clashed with audience expectations shaped by heroic British WWII narratives. Even the film's violence feels mean rather than exciting, and its ending refuses emotional release. In an era when war films still doubled as national reassurance, this one offered only anxiety. Today, the film feels astonishingly modern. Its focus on psychological fracture anticipates later masterpieces like Platoon and The Thin Red Line. Scholars now cite it as a crucial bridge between classical British war cinema and the more introspective, morally ambiguous films that followed. The performances, especially from a young cast forced into emotional exposure, are now praised for their realism. What once alienated audiences is exactly what gives the film its lasting power. It treats war not as spectacle, but as sustained psychological damage. Number 13, The Silent Enemy, 1958. The Silent Enemy quietly slipped into cinemas in 1958 and just as quietly slipped out. Overshadowed by flashier naval epics and larger-scale war productions, it struggled to attract audiences despite its technical competence and authentic subject matter. The box office response was lukewarm at best. At the time, it was seen as minor and forgettable. The film centers on underwater sabotage and frogman operations, stealth, patience, and procedural detail rather than spectacle. There are no massive set pieces or crowd-pleasing heroics. Marketing failed to communicate its tension-driven appeal, and audiences expecting bombast found restraint instead. Compared to louder contemporaries, it felt muted and clinical. Modern reassessment has been generous. Historians now praise the film's authenticity, grounded tactics, and respect for operational realism. Its procedural focus, once considered dull, is now admired as disciplined storytelling. The film captures the anxiety of invisible warfare, where success depends on precision rather than bravado. In an age where audiences value realism and quiet tension, The Silent Enemy feels newly relevant. It's a reminder that some of the most dangerous wartime missions happened in silence, and some of the best war films do too. Number 12. Yesterday's Enemy, 1959. When Yesterday's Enemy arrived at the end of the 1950s, it unsettled nearly everyone who encountered it. British audiences were still accustomed to war films that reassured them, films where discipline prevailed, command structures held firm, and moral choices were ultimately validated. This film offered none of that comfort. Set during a counterinsurgency campaign in Southeast Asia, it presents war as a grinding ethical trap where every decision corrodes something human. The box office response was chilly, almost embarrassed, as if viewers didn't quite know what to do with what they'd seen. The problem at the time was timing. Britain was still publicly clinging to narratives of orderly withdrawal from empire, and Yesterday's Enemy cut too close to contemporary anxieties. The film forces its audience to sit with the consequences of collective punishment, civilian deaths, and moral compromise. There are no grand speeches to soften the blow, just men trying to justify actions they already know are wrong. That level of ambiguity made the film commercially toxic. It wasn't a rousing war picture, and it wasn't escapism either. Decades later, that same discomfort is precisely what gives the film its authority. Modern historians and critics often point to Yesterday's Enemy as one of the earliest British films to confront the moral contradictions of counterinsurgency warfare head-on. Its refusal to judge its characters outright allows the audience to feel the slow erosion of ethical certainty. What once felt accusatory now feels honest. In retrospect, the film anticipates later debates about military ethics and civilian harm, making it feel less like a relic and more like a warning that arrived too early to be welcomed. Number 11. The Ship That Died of Shame, 1955. At first glance, The Ship That Died of Shame barely looks like a war film at all, and that confusion played a major role in its initial failure. Released in 1955, it followed former naval heroes drifting into criminality after the war, haunted by habits that no longer have a place in peacetime Britain. Audiences expecting stirring naval action instead encountered something darker and more corrosive, a noir-tinged meditation on moral decay. Ticket sales reflected that disconnect almost immediately. The film arrived during a period when British cinema still preferred to celebrate wartime sacrifice rather than interrogate its aftermath. Viewers weren't ready to see decorated veterans portrayed as broken men, capable of cruelty and greed. The film's atmosphere, shadowy docks, moral rot, and fatalistic pacing, felt uncomfortably unpatriotic. Critics didn't quite know how to classify it, and audiences stayed away, unsure why a war film seemed so uninterested in heroism. Over time, however, the film has been rediscovered as one of the most honest portrayals of post-war disillusionment ever produced in Britain. Scholars now recognize it as a bridge between wartime cinema and the darker social realism that would define later decades. Its central idea that war doesn't end when the guns fall silent but follows men home feels painfully modern. What once seemed cynical now feels psychologically precise. The ship at the center of the story becomes a symbol of men unable to let go of who they were during the war, drifting toward self-destruction because peace offers them no identity. It's aged not just well, but urgently. Number 10. Danger Within, 1959. Danger Within was never designed to be loud, and that quietness doomed it commercially. Released in 1959, it focused on a single moral dilemma inside a POW camp: whether escaping prisoners should risk exposing others to brutal reprisals. There were no daring chases, no elaborate escape tunnels, no climactic triumph. For audiences trained by the Great Escape-style narratives, this felt anticlimactic and emotionally restrained. Box office numbers reflected that disappointment. The film's restraint was its biggest obstacle. Instead of spectacle, it offered debate. Instead of victory, it offered unresolved tension. Marketing struggled to communicate why this story mattered, and many viewers dismissed it as dull or overly talkative. At the time, POW films were expected to inspire rather than interrogate. Danger Within dared to suggest that courage and responsibility can come into conflict, and that heroism may involve staying put rather than breaking free. Modern reassessment has been far kinder. Historians now praise the film for capturing the ethical complexity of imprisonment better than many of its flashier peers. Its confined setting amplifies the psychological pressure, turning the camp into a moral laboratory. The film asks uncomfortable questions about collective survival versus individual freedom, questions that resonate strongly in contemporary discussions of leadership and sacrifice. What once felt understated now feels disciplined and intelligent. Danger Within doesn't celebrate escape, it examines the cost of it, and in doing so, it quietly earns its place among Britain's most thoughtful war films. Number 9. The Colditz Story, 1955. When The Colditz Story reached cinemas in 1955, expectations worked against it. Audiences were already saturated with wartime heroics, and this film arrived without the grand scale or cinematic flourish people associated with popular POW adventures. Its tone was restrained, procedural, and almost documentary-like. As a result, it performed modestly at best, quickly overshadowed by more flamboyant war spectacles. To many moviegoers, it felt dry, competent, but unexciting. What made the film commercially underwhelming was precisely its seriousness. Rather than focusing on individual heroics, it emphasized organization, patience, and quiet defiance. Escape attempts unfold methodically, without rousing music or exaggerated suspense. Characters blend into a collective effort, rather than standing out as movie star heroes. At the time, this approach clashed with audience desires for emotional highs and narrative payoffs. The film didn't flatter the viewer, it asked them to pay attention. Over time, however, The Colditz Story has gained authority rather than lost relevance. Historians and veterans have increasingly praised its accuracy and respect for real events. The film captures something many later POW movies sacrifice: the grind of imprisonment and the psychological warfare between captors and captives. Its understated performances now read as disciplined rather than dull, and its procedural focus feels authentic instead of restrained. Modern audiences, accustomed to realism and moral nuance, often find the film more compelling than its louder successors. Colditz itself becomes a character, a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and quiet resistance. What once felt unspectacular now feels credible. The film's reputation has steadily grown through television broadcasts, academic discussion, and word of mouth, transforming a box office disappointment into one of Britain's most respected POW films. Number 8. Orders to Kill, 1958. Orders to Kill struggled the moment it arrived. Released in 1958, it disguised itself as a resistance thriller, but delivered something far more disturbing. Audiences expecting sabotage, action, and clean-cut heroism instead encountered a slow, introspective descent into moral uncertainty. The film's pacing was deliberate, its atmosphere heavy, and its conclusion unsettling. Commercially, it never stood a chance. The problem wasn't quality, it was discomfort. The film asks the audience to inhabit the mind of a man ordered to assassinate a suspected collaborator. As doubt creeps in, the story refuses to reassure the viewer that the mission is justified. For post-war audiences still invested in moral clarity, this ambiguity felt almost offensive. The film's refusal to offer certainty or redemption made it a hard sell, and it quietly faded from theaters. In retrospect, Orders to Kill stands as one of the most psychologically sophisticated war films Britain ever produced. Its power lies in its restraint. Violence is not thrilling, it is hesitant, personal, and devastating. The film anticipates later moral thrillers by decades, placing responsibility and guilt at the center of the narrative. Scholars now view it as a turning point where British war cinema briefly abandoned reassurance in favor of ethical inquiry. Today, the film feels eerily modern. Its questions about obedience, accountability, and the cost of killing on suspicion alone resonate strongly in contemporary discussions of warfare and intelligence operations. What once repelled audiences now commands respect. Orders to Kill didn't fail because it lacked tension. It failed because it forced viewers to confront their own assumptions. Time has transformed that discomfort into admiration. Number 7. The Angry Silence, 1960. Although not a battlefield war film in the traditional sense, The Angry Silence belongs firmly on this list because it treats ideology as a battlefield and conformity as a weapon. Released in 1960, it arrived poorly marketed and deeply misunderstood. Audiences expecting conventional drama were confronted with an intense moral standoff centered on labor conflict, isolation, and personal conviction. The box office response was muted, and the film quickly slipped from public conversation. The issue was framing. Viewers didn't know how to approach a story that replaced guns and uniforms with social pressure and psychological siege. The film's protagonist becomes a target not through violence, but through silence, ostracized for refusing to participate in collective coercion. At the time, this felt uncomfortably close to real social tensions, and many audiences recoiled from its implications. It wasn't escapist. It was confrontational. Decades later, the film has been reassessed as a powerful allegory of ideological warfare. Critics now recognize its kinship with war films that examine pressure, loyalty, and moral endurance. Its relevance has only grown, especially in discussions of groupthink and institutional power. The film's claustrophobic intensity, once seen as unpleasant, is now admired for its precision. It captures the experience of being under siege without firing a single shot. What once seemed niche now feels universal. The Angry Silence demonstrates that war isn't always fought on distant fronts. It can be waged quietly, socially, and relentlessly. Its box office failure looks less like rejection and more like avoidance. Time has revealed it as one of Britain's most quietly devastating wartime allegories. Number 6. Ice Cold in Alex, 1958. When Ice Cold in Alex was released in 1958, it didn't fail spectacularly. It failed quietly. Audiences turned up, but not in the numbers studios hoped for. Marketed as a conventional desert war adventure, the film instead delivered something slower, more introspective, and far more human than expected. Its emphasis on endurance over action left many viewers uncertain how to respond. The box office reflected that uncertainty, and the film slipped into modest obscurity. What held it back commercially was its refusal to sensationalize survival. Much of the film unfolds in silence, heat, and exhaustion. The enemy is present, but rarely visible. The real conflict is dehydration, fatigue, and emotional wear. In an era when war films still leaned heavily on spectacle, Ice Cold in Alex felt restrained, even subdued. It asked patience from audiences who weren't yet accustomed to war as an internal experience rather than an external one. Time has elevated the film dramatically. Today, it's regarded as one of the most authentic depictions of wartime survival ever filmed. Veterans have often praised its attention to detail, particularly its portrayal of desert warfare's psychological toll. The film's now famous final moments, once considered anticlimactic, are celebrated as one of British cinema's most earned releases of tension. What once seemed slow now feels immersive. Ice Cold in Alex didn't age into relevance by changing. It aged into relevance because audiences finally caught up to its honesty. Number 5. The Wooden Horse, 1950. The Wooden Horse arrived in 1950 with impeccable credentials and respectable craftsmanship. Yet it struggled to connect with mass audiences. Compared to more dramatic escape films, its tone was methodical and restrained. There were no daring last-minute rescues, no rousing musical cues, and no flamboyant heroics. As a result, audiences largely passed it by, and its box office impact was limited. The issue was expectation. POW films were already forming a template: bravery, cleverness, and spectacle. The Wooden Horse offered instead a procedural breakdown of escape logistics, measurements, planning, repetition, and quiet discipline. It trusted viewers to appreciate process over payoff. At the time, many didn't. The film felt instructional rather than thrilling, and its refusal to dramatize tension made it easy to overlook. In the decades since, that precision has become its greatest strength. Historians now cite The Wooden Horse as one of the most accurate escape films ever made. Its depiction of cooperation, patience, and intellectual resistance aligns closely with real POW accounts. Modern audiences often find it more convincing than later, flashier films. What once seemed emotionally distant now feels deeply respectful. The film doesn't mythologize escape. And that commitment to realism has allowed the wooden horse to quietly outlast many of its more popular contemporaries. Number 4. The Battle of the River Plate, 1956. When the Battle of the River Plate was released in 1956, it carried the burden of expectation. Naval war films were expected to deliver scale, spectacle, and overwhelming force. Instead, this film focused on strategy, restraint, and psychological pressure. While critically respected, it failed to ignite box office excitement, particularly among audiences seeking grand naval destruction. The film's realism worked against it commercially. Naval engagements here are cautious, tactical affairs dominated by radio silence and decision-making rather than continuous action. For viewers accustomed to more dramatic portrayals of sea combat, this approach felt distant and emotionally reserved. The film trusted its audience to appreciate nuance, a gamble that didn't pay off at the time. Today, the Battle of the River Plate is widely admired for exactly those qualities. Naval historians often praise its tactical accuracy and balanced portrayal of both sides of the conflict. The film treats warfare as a chess match rather than a brawl, emphasizing command responsibility and strategic consequence. Modern viewers, especially those interested in military history, recognize its sophistication. What once seemed understated now feels intelligent. The film didn't lack excitement, it lacked exaggeration. And in hindsight, that restraint is precisely what gives it enduring value. Number 3. The Cruel Sea, 1953. When The Cruel Sea was released in 1953, it was expected to be a major commercial success. On paper, it had everything: a respected novel, a serious tone, and a focus on the Battle of the Atlantic, one of Britain's defining wartime struggles. Yet, despite respectable attendance, it underperformed relative to expectations and failed to become the popular hit studios had hoped for. Audiences admired it, but they didn't embrace it. The film was praised more than it was loved. Part of the problem lay in its emotional severity. This was not a comforting naval adventure. The film confronts viewers with relentless attrition, exhaustion, and moral anguish. Decisions are made that cost lives, sometimes friendly ones, and the film refuses to soften those consequences. At the time, many viewers found this distancing. British audiences were still accustomed to narratives where sacrifice led to reassurance. The Cruel Sea offered duty without consolation. As decades passed, the film's reputation steadily rose. Naval historians and veterans increasingly pointed to it as one of the most truthful depictions of convoy warfare ever filmed. Its episodic structure, once criticized as cold, now reads as an accurate reflection of endless patrols and cumulative trauma. The sea itself becomes the antagonist, indifferent, grinding, and merciless. What once felt emotionally austere now feels morally serious. The film doesn't glorify endurance, it documents the cost of it. That integrity has allowed The Cruel Sea to mature into a cornerstone of British war cinema. Number 2. Went the Day Well? 1942. Went the day well? Failed in a way few war films ever have, it was rejected during wartime itself. Released in 1942 at the height of national emergency, the film unnerved audiences with its premise: a peaceful English village infiltrated by enemy soldiers disguised as allies. Viewers found it disturbing rather than reassuring, and its box office performance reflected that discomfort. For a nation seeking unity and morale, the film felt like a provocation. The issue was psychological proximity. This wasn't a distant battlefield or heroic front line, it was home. The film suggests that danger could arrive quietly, politely, and without warning. Its violence is sudden and shocking, particularly in its treatment of civilians. Wartime audiences, already under stress, recoiled from a story that undermined the illusion of safety on the home front. It wasn't what people wanted to imagine. In later decades, the film has been widely reappraised as one of Britain's boldest wartime achievements. Critics now praise its nerve and its willingness to confront vulnerability head-on. It captures the paranoia and fear that official propaganda often avoided. Modern viewers recognize it as a psychological thriller masquerading as wartime drama, one that anticipates later invasion and occupation narratives. What once felt dangerous now feels honest. The film's warning that complacency is itself a threat, has aged with chilling clarity, transforming an uncomfortable wartime failure into a lasting classic. Number 1. The Hill, 1965. When The Hill arrived in 1965, it landed like a challenge rather than an invitation. Audiences expecting a conventional POW film were confronted with something far harsher, a blistering examination of power, cruelty, and institutional sadism within a British-run military prison. The response was swift and unforgiving. The film struggled commercially, alienating viewers who found its intensity overwhelming and its lack of heroism deeply unsettling. The film offered no relief. Set almost entirely within the confines of a desert stockade, it replaces enemy forces with authority figures who abuse their power in the name of discipline. Physical suffering is relentless, but the psychological erosion is worse. At the time, this portrayal of British officers as antagonists was too radical. The film challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about moral superiority and righteous command. Many viewers simply turned away. Today, The Hill is widely regarded as one of the greatest British war films ever made. Scholars and critics praise its uncompromising honesty and its refusal to excuse cruelty under institutional logic. Its themes, systemic abuse, moral cowardice, and the cost of obedience, feel timeless. What once seemed confrontational now feels essential. The film didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because it spoke too clearly, too soon. Time has not softened its impact, only sharpened its relevance. That is why it stands at the top of this list. These films didn't fail because they lacked craft or conviction. They failed because they challenged comforting myths before audiences were ready. History caught up. Tastes matured. What remains are war films that refused reassurance and earned something better instead: lasting respect, relevance, and truth.